in the spaces between memory and myth, where starlight touches ancient stone and silence holds the weight of forgotten names. There lived souls whose very existence bends the spine of history. They moved through their worlds like shadows cast by invisible flames, leaving behind riddles carved in gold and questions that echo still through corridors of time. Tonight, we walk beside them in the hours before dawn, when the veil between worlds grows thin and the whispers of the past become as real as breath upon our skin. Here, in the gentle darkness, their stories unfold like prayers spoken in languages we have forgotten how to speak, yet somehow still understand. If this journey into history gently moves you, take a second to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more sleepy minds find their way here, by the way. Where in the world are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment before you drift off. We read every single one. The desert wind carries secrets older than kingdoms. And in the 14th century, before the Common Era, it whispered the name of a king who dared to reshape the very foundations of eternity. Akhenaten stood at the edge of his palace terrace in the city of Akhenaten, watching the disk of the sun climb above the horizon like a golden eye opening upon the world. In his long, angular face-to-face that would puzzle archaeologists for millennia, there burned a vision so radical it would shake the pillars of heaven and earth. He had been born Imhotep IV, heir to an empire that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates, inheritor of traditions as old as the pyramids themselves. But somewhere in the chambers of his soul, a different light had begun to grow. The priests of Amun-Ra, with their elaborate rituals and vast temple complexes, with their 1,000 gods and million prayers, had begun to seem like shadows dancing on cave walls. For Akhenaten had glimpsed something beyond the shadows, a single, pure radiance that made all other worship seem like the babbling of children. The Aten, he called it, the disk of the sun. Not the sun god Ra with his falcon head and boat of night, not the complex mythology of death and rebirth that had sustained Egypt for 2,000 years, but something simpler and more radical than any pharaoh had ever imagined. The Aten was the source of all life, the giver of breath, the tender of plants, the warmer of eggs in their nests. In its light, all beings were equal. In its radiance, even the pharaoh was merely another child basking in divine love. But revolution, even divine revolution, comes with a price written in blood and tears. The priests who had served the old gods for generations watched in horror as their temples were closed, their sacred names chiseled from stone, their power dissolved like salt in water. The people, confused and frightened, whispered in the markets and along the riverbanks. The nobles, sensing weakness, began to plot, and in the great cities of Memphis and Thebes, where the old ways ran deeper than the foundations of the pyramids, resistance began to crystallize like ice in winter. Akhenaten seemed to float above it all, sustained by his vision of universal harmony under the Aten's rays. With his queen Nefertiti, whose beauty would echo through the ages like a song remembered in dreams, he presided over a court unlike any Egypt had ever seen. Gone were the stiff, formal poses of traditional Egyptian art. In their place appeared scenes of tender intimacy, the royal family playing with their children under the sun's rays, Akhenaten and Nefertiti sharing quiet moments of affection, the Aten's hands reaching down to touch their faces with beams of light that ended in tiny, caring fingers. The king's own appearance was revolutionary in its strangeness. Where pharaohs had traditionally been depicted as perfect specimens of masculine power, Akhenaten appeared almost alien in his elongated features, his swollen belly, his wide hips, his thin arms. Some scholars would later wonder if he suffered from a genetic condition, others if he was deliberately portrayed as androgynous to reflect some deeper theological truth. But in those ancient images, carved in relief on temple walls and painted on tomb chambers, he appears as something between human and divine. Neither fully man nor woman, but something entirely new under the sun. For 17 years, this strange experiment in monotheism flickered like a candle flame in the desert wind. Akhenaten, the city he built to honor the Aten, rose from the sand like a mirage made real. Its temples were open to the sky, its art revolutionary in its naturalism. Its very existence a testament to one man's vision of a world transformed by divine light. Merchants from across the known world came to trade in its markets. Diplomats from Babylon and Assyria walked its streets, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the old ways might truly be swept away by the force of revelation. But empires are not built on vision alone, and the practical concerns of ruling a vast kingdom began to press in upon the heretic king like desert sand through the cracks in palace walls. Military campaigns went unfought. Diplomatic correspondence went unanswered, and the wealth that flowed from conquered territories began to slow to a trickle. The Hittites pressed from the north, the Nubians stirred in the south, and the great trading networks that had sustained Egyptian prosperity for centuries began to fray, like old rope under strain. When Akhenaten died, whether from illness, poison, or simply the weight of his impossible dreams, the forces of reaction were ready. His successor, a young man who had been born to Tutankhaten, but would soon change his name to Tutankhamun, bowed to the pressure of priests and nobles. The old gods were restored, the temples reopened, the capital moved back to Memphis, and Akhenaten, the city of the sun, was abandoned to the desert wind and the slow, patient work of time. Within a generation, it was as if Akhenaten had never existed. His name was chiseled from king lists, his monuments torn down or built over, his revolutionary art style abandoned for the timeless forms of traditional Egyptian sculpture. The priests of Amun-Ra spoke of him, when they spoke of him at all, as the heretic, the criminal, the enemy of the gods. For 3,000 years he slumbered in the sand, a dream half remembered, a whisper on the wind, on the Greek island of Samos, where the Aegean Sea meets the sky in an endless dance of blue and silver. A child was born who would grow to hear the music of the spheres. The year was around 570 BCE, though time keeps its secrets carefully in those distant centuries, and the child's name was Pythagoras. Even in the womb, it was said, his mother dreamed of golden light and heard strange harmonies that seemed to rise from the very structure of existence itself. From his earliest years, Pythagoras seemed to exist in two worlds simultaneously. In the physical world, he was a precocious boy who excelled in mathematics, music, and poetry. But in the realm of the spirit, he walked paths that older and wiser men could barely glimpse. His teachers spoke in hushed tones of his ability to perceive patterns where others saw only chaos, to find meaning in the relationships between numbers that others treated as mere tools for counting sheep and measuring grain. When he reached manhood, the restless hunger for wisdom drove him from his island home like a ship following a star. He journeyed to Egypt, where the priests of ancient temples shared with him secrets that had been old when the pyramids were young. In the shadow of those great monuments, he learned that numbers were not merely practical tools, but sacred entities, each one vibrating with its own spiritual frequency, each ratio and proportion reflecting the fundamental harmonies that held the cosmos together. From Egypt, his quest led him to Babylon, where the Chaldean astrologers had mapped the movements of the stars with mathematical precision that bordered on the supernatural. There, among the ziggurats that rose like stairways to heaven, he discovered that the same numerical relationships that governed musical harmony also ruled the orbits of planets, the growth of plants, the proportions of the human body. The universe, he began to understand, was not a collection of separate things, but a single, vast symphony of mathematical relationships. But it was in southern Italy, in the Greek colony of Croton, that Pythagoras would establish his most mysterious legacy. There, around 530 BCE, he founded a school that was equal parts monastery, university, and mystery cult. The Pythagoreans, as they came to be known, lived according to rules that seemed strange even to their contemporaries. They abstained from eating beans, which they believed contained human souls in the process of reincarnation. They shared all property in common, considering individual ownership a barrier to spiritual development. And they swore solemn oaths never to reveal the sacred mathematical truths that Pythagoras taught them in the inner sanctum of the school. The oath of silence was not mere secrecy for its own sake, but recognition that certain knowledge was too powerful to be shared carelessly. Pythagoras had discovered, through years of careful investigation, that mathematics was not merely a human invention, but the very language in which the gods had written the universe. The famous theorem that bears his name, that in a right triangle, the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, was not simply a practical tool for builders and surveyors, but a window into the fundamental structure of reality itself. The Pythagoreans lived their lives according to this mathematical mysticism. They rose before dawn to perform exercises that were equal parts physical and spiritual, designed to align their bodies and souls with the cosmic harmonies. They studied music not merely as entertainment, but as a path to understanding the mathematics of beauty. They observed the heavens, not simply to predict eclipses and seasons, but to hear the celestial music that Pythagoras claimed emanated from the movements of the planets. This music of the spheres, which only the most spiritually advanced could perceive, was perhaps Pythagoras's greatest discovery. He taught that each planet, as it moved through its orbit, produced a tone determined by its speed and distance from the center of the universe. These tones, when combined, created a cosmic symphony of indescribable beauty. Most humans could not hear this celestial music because they had been listening to it from birth and had grown deaf to its constant presence. Like people who live near a waterfall and no longer notice its sound. The mathematical relationships that governed this cosmic music were the same ones that determined the intervals of musical harmony on Earth. When a blacksmith struck his anvil with hammers of different weights, the resulting tones reflected the same numerical ratios that governed the movements of the stars. When a lyre player plucked strings of different lengths, the harmonies produced echoed the mathematical structure of the cosmos itself. Music, mathematics, and mysticism were not separate disciplines, but different aspects of a single, unified truth. But the most profound and troubling discovery that emerged from the Pythagorean school was one that would shake the foundations of their mathematical worldview. A student, working on the problem of the diagonal of a square, discovered that certain numerical relationships could not be expressed as ratios of whole numbers. The square root of 2, for instance, was neither rational nor comprehensible in terms of the neat, orderly numerical relationships that Pythagoras had taught governed all of reality. This discovery of irrational numbers was so disturbing to the Pythagorean worldview that legend says the student who first proved their existence was murdered by his fellow disciples, and his discovery was suppressed as a threat to the cosmic order. Whether or not this dramatic tale is true, the mathematical crisis it represents was real. The universe, it seemed, contained mysteries that could not be captured in the neat ratios and proportions that had seemed to explain everything. Pythagoras himself remains as elusive as the numbers he studied. Historical sources from his own time tell us almost nothing about his life, his teachings, or even his appearance. Later writers, from Plato to medieval Islamic scholars to Renaissance mathematicians, all claimed him as an influence, but their accounts often contradict each other and blur the line between history and mythology. Some said he could be in two places at once, others that he could remember his past lives, still others that he had a golden thigh that proved his divine nature. What seems certain is that Pythagoras represented a unique moment in human intellectual history when mathematics, music, mysticism, and moral philosophy were still unified in a single vision of cosmic harmony. In our age of specialized knowledge, when mathematicians rarely speak to musicians and physicists inhabit a world apart from poets, it is difficult to imagine the synthesis that Pythagoras achieved. Yet his influence echoes still in every mathematical equation, every musical composition, every attempt to find pattern and meaning in the apparent chaos of existence. In the red-gold light of an Egyptian dawn, when the Nile flows like molten bronze and the desert sands whisper secrets to the morning wind, there rises from the Saqqara Plateau a structure that would forever change humanity's relationship with eternity. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, built around 2670 BCE, stands as the world's first monumental stone building, and its architect was a man whose name would echo through the corridors of time, like a prayer spoken in an ancient tongue. Imhotep. Imhotep was no ordinary architect. In a civilization that revered specialists, he was a Renaissance man to millennia before the Renaissance, a figure of such extraordinary capabilities that he seemed to exist at the intersection of the human and divine. He was architect and engineer, physician and priest, sage and magician, astronomer and administrator. The Egyptians themselves, in their careful hierarchies and rigid social structures, seemed unable to classify him. They could only marvel at the breadth of his genius and whisper that the gods had walked among them in the form of a man. Born during the third dynasty of the Old Kingdom, when Egypt was still young and the great pyramid builders of Giza were still centuries in the future, Imhotep served as chancellor to Pharaoh Djoser. But his influence extended far beyond the usual duties of a court official. He was the king's confidant and counselor, the architect of royal policy as well as royal monuments. When Djoser decided to build a tomb that would surpass all previous royal burials in grandeur and permanence, he turned to Imhotep with a commission that would challenge the very limits of human imagination. The traditional royal tomb of the time was a mastaba, a rectangular mud brick structure that rose only a few meters above the ground. It was adequate for preserving the pharaoh's body and possessions for the journey to the afterlife, but it lacked the monumentality that Djoser desired. He wanted something that would proclaim his glory not just to his own subjects, but to the gods themselves. Something that would stand as long as the stars continued their eternal dance across the night. Sky Imhotep's solution was revolutionary in its simplicity and breathtaking in its ambition. Instead of building a single mastaba, he would stack mastaba upon mastaba, each one smaller than the one below, creating a stepped pyramid that would rise toward the heavens like a stairway for the pharaoh's soul. But even more revolutionary was his decision to build, not in mud brick, the traditional material of Egyptian architecture, but in stone. Carved limestone blocks, each one fitted with mathematical precision. would replace the perishable materials of the past with the eternal substance of the earth itself. The technical challenges were enormous. No one had ever attempted to build on such a scale in stone. The quarrying, transportation, and precise placement of thousands of limestone blocks required innovations in engineering that pushed the limits of Bronze Age technology. Imhotep had to invent new techniques for cutting stone, new methods for moving massive blocks across the desert, new approaches to ensuring that the structure would remain stable as it rose toward the sky. But the step pyramid was more than just an engineering triumph. It was a theological statement carved in stone, a physical manifestation of beliefs about death, resurrection, and the pharaoh's divine nature that would influence Egyptian religion for 3,000 years. The six-step structure represented the primordial mound from which, according to Egyptian mythology, all creation had emerged. By climbing these steps, the pharaoh's soul could rise from the underworld to join the imperishable stars in their eternal circuits around the pole of heaven. The pyramid complex that surrounded the central monument was equally revolutionary. Imhotep created an entire city of the dead, with temples, courtyards, storage chambers, and ceremonial buildings all carved from stone and designed to serve the pharaoh's needs in the afterlife. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Stone columns were carved to imitate the bundled reed columns of earlier wooden structures. Walls were decorated with reliefs that depicted the pharaoh performing the rituals of kingship for eternity, and hidden chambers contained supplies for the long journey through the underworld. The precision of the construction amazed even Imhotep's contemporaries. The limestone blocks were fitted together with such accuracy that a knife blade could not be inserted between them. The angles and proportions of the structure reflected a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and geometry that would not be surpassed for centuries. And the sheer scale of the undertaking. The pyramid rises 62 meters above the desert floor and contains over 330,000 cubic meters of stone, testified to an organizational ability that transformed the theoretical into the actual through sheer force of vision and will. But Imhotep's genius extended far beyond architecture. Ancient texts refer to him as a physician whose healing skills were so remarkable that they seemed magical to his contemporaries. 2,000 years after his death, he was worshipped as a god of medicine, and sick pilgrims would sleep in his temples, hoping to receive healing dreams from the deified architect. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in existence, is sometimes attributed to him, though its actual authorship remains mysterious. His writings on medicine, mathematics, and architecture were studied by scholars throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The Greeks identified him with their own god of healing, Asclepius, and Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt built temples in his honor. Roman tourists visiting Egypt sought out his monuments, and medieval Islamic scholars preserved fragments of texts attributed to him long after the original sources had been lost. Yet for all his fame in the ancient world, Imhotep gradually faded from historical memory as the centuries passed. His name disappeared from the records, his writings were lost, and even the location of his tomb became unknown. By the time European archaeologists began exploring Egypt in the 19th century, he had become little more than a legend, a half-remembered figure from the dawn of recorded history. It was not until the rediscovery and excavation of the Step Pyramid complex in the 20th century that Imhotep's true achievement became apparent to the modern world. Here, in the oldest monumental stone building on Earth, archaeologists found evidence of a creative genius that had literally invented the architectural language of eternity. The techniques he developed for working in stone, the proportional systems he used, the integration of structure and symbolism that characterized his work. All of these would influence Egyptian architecture for the next 3 millennia. The Step Pyramid stands today much as Imhotep left it over 4.5 millennia ago, weathered by wind and sand but still proclaiming its message to the sky. In the rose-colored light of dawn, when the desert wind whispers across the ancient stones, it is possible to sense something of the vision that brought it into being. Here is humanity's first great attempt to build for eternity, to create something that would outlast the civilizations that made it, to transform the temporary into the permanent through the application of knowledge, skill, and an almost supernatural determination to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. Imhotep's legacy extends far beyond the monuments he built. He represents a moment in human history when the boundaries between science and religion, between the practical and the mystical, between the human and the divine, were not yet fixed. In his person, the various strands of human knowledge and aspiration were woven together into a single, luminous whole. He was what we might call a complete human being. Someone who had developed all of his faculties to their highest potential and used them in service of a vision that transcended his own mortality. As we move deeper into our exploration of histories, most enigmatic figures, Imhotep serves as a reminder that the greatest achievements of the human spirit often emerge from this integration of different ways of knowing. The scientist who is also a poet, the architect who is also a philosopher, the healer who is also a mystic. These are the figures who push the boundaries of what it means to be human and leave behind legacies that continue to inspire long after their physical forms have returned to dust. The wind continues to blow across the Saqqara Plateau, carrying with it the whispers of ancient voices and the dreams of those who dared to build for eternity. In that wind, if we listen carefully, we can still hear the echo of Imhotep's vision of human possibility that transcends the boundaries of time and speaks to something eternal in the human heart. And as we prepare to journey deeper into the mysteries of the past, that vision serves as both inspiration and guide, reminding us that the greatest secrets of history often lie not in what people built, but in who they dared to become. The whispered names of those who walked between worlds echo still through corridors of stone and silence, in the shadow of pyramids that pierce the sky like frozen prayers. The keepers of ancient wisdom left behind more than monuments. They left behind questions that time cannot answer, mysteries that deepen with each passing millennium. In the 14th century before the Common Era, when the Nile ran golden with abundance and the gods seemed to smile upon the fertile black land, a young man ascended to the throne of the two lands with a vision that would shake the foundations of the most ancient civilization on earth. His birth name was Amenhotep, meaning Amen is satisfied, but history would remember him by another name entirely Akhenaten, beneficial to the Aten. Picture, if you will, the moment when this pharaoh first gazed upon the solar disk hanging like a burning eye in the limitless blue of the Egyptian sky. Something in that light spoke to him in ways that the complex pantheon of his ancestors never had. Where others saw Ra sailing his golden bark across the heavens, where priests chanted to Amun-Ra in darkened temples thick with incense, Akhenaten saw something simpler and yet infinitely more profound: the pure, undiluted essence of divine light itself. The transformation did not happen overnight. In the royal palace at Thebes, surrounded by the accumulated wealth and wisdom of 18 dynasties, the young pharaoh began to question everything. The priests of Ammon, whose power had grown so vast that they controlled nearly a third of Egypt's cultivated land, watched with growing unease as their divine ruler turned his face away from the traditional gods. The carved reliefs on temple walls that had remained unchanged for millennia suddenly seemed to whisper of stagnation rather than stability. Akhenaten's revolutionary vision extended far beyond theology. In his mind's eye, he saw a new kind of art, a new way of depicting the human form that abandoned the rigid conventions of pharaonic portraiture, where previous rulers had been shown as perfect, godlike beings with idealized features and impossible poses. Akhenaten commissioned artisans to portray him with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a face that seemed almost alien in its otherworldly proportions. His queen, the legendary Nefertiti, was depicted with a grace and naturalism that made her seem to breathe from within the stone. The revolutionary Pharaoh's most audacious act was the founding of a new capital city in the desert, halfway between Memphis and Thebes, on virgin ground that belonged to no existing god. Akhenaten on horizon of the Aten rose from the sands like a mirage made manifest. Modern archaeologists call it Amarna, and even in its ruined state, the city speaks of a dream so powerful that it convinced thousands to abandon their ancestral homes and follow their pharaoh into the wilderness. Walking through the ruins of Amarna today, one can almost feel the ghost of that ancient experiment in monotheism. The streets were laid out with mathematical precision, aligned to capture the first rays of the morning sun. The royal palace sprawled across acres, its walls decorated with scenes of the royal family bathing in the life-giving rays of the Aten. Unlike the dark, mysterious temples of the traditional gods, the shrines to the Aten were open to the sky, allowing the sun's light to fall unimpeded upon the worshippers below. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Akhenaten's revolution was not what he built, but what he tried to erase. Throughout Egypt, his agents chiseled away the names of Amen from temple walls, defacing monuments that had stood for centuries. The word gods was systematically replaced with God, singular. It was as if the pharaoh sought to rewrite not just the present, but the past itself, to create a world where only his truth had ever existed. The great hymn to the Aten, possibly composed by Akhenaten himself, reveals the depth of his mystical experience. In verses that would later echo in the biblical Psalms, the pharaoh praised his God as the sole creator of all life, the hidden power behind the sun that gave breath to every creature. You place every man in his place, the hymn declares. You provide for his needs. Everyone has his food, and his lifetime is counted. It was a vision of divine love that embraced all of creation, Egyptian and foreign alike. Yet for all its beauty, Akhenaten's vision contained the seeds of its own destruction. The pharaoh's single-minded devotion to the Aten left little room for the complex web of relationships that held Egyptian society together. The powerful priesthood of Amen, suddenly stripped of their influence, became implacable enemies. Provincial governors, no longer receiving their traditional religious justification for authority, began to question the pharaoh's legitimacy. Even ordinary Egyptians, deprived of their familiar gods and goddesses, began to whisper of divine displeasure. The international situation deteriorated as well. The famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence discovered in the ruins of the city, tell a story of an empire in decline. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine pleaded desperately for military aid as their territories fell to invaders. But Akhenaten, absorbed in his religious reforms, seemed oblivious to the crumbling of Egypt's international influence. "Send me help, or I will die," wrote one loyal ally. But the help never came. As Akhenaten's reign entered its final phase, strange events began to unfold at Amarna. The pharaoh seemed to retreat further into mysticism, spending long hours in meditation before the sacred symbol of the Aten. Some scholars suggest that he may have appointed a corolla, possibly his own daughter or a mysterious figure known only as Smenkhare, whose gender and relationship to the royal family remain hotly debated. The royal workshops produced increasingly bizarre art, showing the pharaoh and his family with ever more exaggerated features, as if they were transforming into beings from another world. The end came swiftly. In the 17th year of his reign, Akhenaten simply vanished from the historical record. His mummy has never been found, and the circumstances of his death remain one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Some suggest he was assassinated by conservative priests. Others believe he died of natural causes, possibly from the genetic disorders that might explain his unusual appearance. A few romantic souls imagine that he simply walked into the desert one morning, following the path of his beloved sun disk into the eternal light. What followed was a systematic attempt to erase not just Akhenaten, but his entire experiment from history. His young successor, originally named Tutankhaten, changed his name to Tutankhamen and moved the capital back to Thebes. The priests of Amun returned to power with a vengeance, chiseling Akhenaten's name from monuments and adding it to the official list of enemies of Egypt. Amarna was abandoned so completely that within a generation, desert sand began to reclaim the city of the sun. Yet Akhenaten's legacy lived on in ways that his enemies could never fully suppress. Embodied most powerfully in the enigmatic figure of his queen, Nefertiti. Her name means the beautiful one has come, and from the moment her famous limestone bust was discovered in the ruins of Amarna, she has captivated the modern world as powerfully as she must have fascinated her contemporaries. But behind the perfect beauty that made her face iconic lies a mystery that deepens with every archaeological discovery. Nefertiti was more than just a royal consort. She was a revolutionary in her own right. Unlike previous queens who remained largely in the background of Egyptian royal propaganda, Nefertiti appeared alongside her husband in countless reliefs, participating in religious ceremonies and even performing rituals traditionally reserved for the pharaoh himself. In some images, she is shown smiting Egypt's enemies, a pose that had been exclusively pharaonic for over 1,000 years. The intimate family scenes carved on the walls of Amarna present Nefertiti in a light that was revolutionary for ancient art. She and Akhenaten are shown playing with their 6 daughters, kissing in public, sharing private moments that earlier Egyptian art would never have depicted. The rays of the Aten touch them all equally, suggesting a vision of royal family life that was both more human and more divine than anything that had come before. But perhaps the most intriguing mystery surrounding Nefertiti concerns her ultimate fate. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, she disappears from the artistic record as suddenly as if she had been erased by an invisible hand. Some scholars believe she died, possibly in childbirth or from plague. Others suggest something far more dramatic, that she transformed herself into the mysterious Kurulus, taking on a male identity to secure her power in the patriarchal world of pharaonic Egypt. This theory, controversial as it is, finds support in several tantalizing clues. Smenkhare appears in the historical record at exactly the moment Nefertiti vanishes. The mummy, tentatively identified as Smenkhare, shows feminine characteristics. Most intriguingly, some inscriptions seem to show Smenkhare using feminine grammatical forms, as if the scribe forgot which gender identity the ruler was supposed to be using. If Nefertiti did indeed become Smenkhare, it would make her one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history, a woman who not only shared power with her husband during his lifetime, but potentially ruled Egypt in her own right after his death. The thought of this beautiful queen, transformed by circumstances into a male pharaoh, struggling to hold together her husband's crumbling religious revolution, adds a layer of poignant heroism to an already compelling story. The mystery deepens when we consider the possibility that Nefertiti might have been the immediate predecessor of Tutankhamun. If she ruled as Smenkhare for a brief period after Akhenaten's death, she would have been the bridge between the heretic pharaoh and the boy king who restored the old gods. In this scenario, she becomes a tragic figure, a true believer in the Aten who was forced to watch her husband's revolution crumble and perhaps even participated in its reversal to save the dynasty. The search for Nefertiti's mummy has become one of archaeology's holy grails. In recent years, radar scans of Tutankhamun's tomb have suggested the presence of hidden chambers, leading to speculation that the burial place of the legendary queen might lie just beyond a wall that has hidden her for over 3 millennia. The thought that she might be resting there still, perhaps with the treasures of Amarna and the secrets of Akhenaten's revolution, has captured imaginations around the world. Centuries before Nefertiti challenged the conventions of queenship, another woman had already shattered the ultimate glass ceiling of the ancient world. Her name was Hatshepsut, and for 22 years, she ruled Egypt not as a queen regent for a male heir, but as pharaoh in her own right, a living goddess, who wore the false beard of kingship and claimed the divine right to rule the 2 lands. The story of Hatshepsut's rise to power reads like something from a political thriller. She was initially the wife of Thutmose II, a pharaoh whose reign was cut short by illness. When he died, the throne should have passed to his son by a minor wife, but the heir was still a child. Hatshepsut stepped in as regent, a role that powerful royal women had filled before. But somewhere in the first few years of her regency, something unprecedented happened. She claimed the throne for herself. The transformation was gradual but revolutionary. Early reliefs show Hatshepsut in traditional feminine dress, standing behind the young Thutmose III as his protector and guide. But as the years passed, her image began to change. The feminine clothes gave way to the traditional pharaonic regalia: false beard, the crook and flail, the divine Urius serpent upon her brow. In the most sophisticated propaganda campaign in ancient history, Hatshepsut convinced her subjects that she was not a woman masquerading as a pharaoh, but a pharaoh who happened to inhabit a female body. Her masterpiece was the magnificent temple at Deir el-Bahari, carved directly into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, rising in 3 terrace levels connected by ramps and colonnades. The temple was unlike anything that had been built before. Where other pharaohs had built massive pyramids or towering obelisks to assert their power, Hatshepsut created something that seemed to grow naturally from the living rock, as if the gods themselves had carved it from the mountain. The walls of this temple tell the story of Hatshepsut's divine legitimacy through a series of carefully crafted myths. In one relief cycle, she claims that her true father was not the human Thutmose I, but the god Amen himself, who had assumed the form of her mortal father to conceive her. Another series of carvings depicts her coronation in the afterlife, where she receives the blessing of all the gods and goddesses of Egypt. It was theological justification, taken to its logical extreme. If she could prove she was chosen by the gods, who could question her right to rule? But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of Hatshepsut's reign was her relationship with Thutmose III, the young man she had displaced. Modern historians long assumed that this relationship must have been filled with tension and resentment, that the Queen Pharaoh kept her stepson, nephew under house arrest, while she usurped his rightful throne. Recent archaeological evidence paints a more complex picture. Thutmose III appears to have held significant military commands during Hatshepsut's reign, suggesting that she trusted him with real power. Some scholars now believe that their relationship may have been genuinely collaborative, a unique experiment in shared rule that worked precisely because it was so unprecedented. Hatshepsut's reign was marked not by military conquests, but by prosperity and innovation. She sent trading expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt, bringing back exotic goods and living myrrh trees that were transplanted to her temple terraces. She commissioned more obelisks than any pharaoh except Ramesses II, including the tallest one ever successfully erected by the ancient Egyptians. Her architects and artists created a distinctive style that combined traditional Egyptian motifs with unprecedented naturalism and grace. The mystery of Hatshepsut deepens when we consider how completely she was erased from the historical record. After her death, sometime during the later years of Thutmose III's independent reign, her name was systematically chiseled from monuments throughout Egypt. Her statues were broken and buried, her obelisks were walled up, and her very existence was excised from the official king lists. For over 3,000 years, she remained virtually unknown to the modern world. This systematic erasure has led to intense debate among historians. Was it revenge by Thutmose III, finally expressing his resentment at being displaced for 2 decades? Or was it something more practical, an attempt to preserve the legitimacy of the pharaonic institution by erasing the precedent of a female ruler? Some scholars suggest a third possibility, that the erasure was carried out not by Thutmose III himself, but by his successors, who feared that Hatshepsut's example might inspire other royal women to claim the throne. The discovery of Hatshepsut's mummy in 2007 added new layers to the mystery. Using DNA analysis and forensic archaeology, researchers identified her remains in a previously anonymous mummy found in a simple tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The woman who had claimed divine status in life had been buried with remarkable modesty, far from the elaborate tomb she had prepared for herself. Her body showed signs of diabetes, cancer, and other ailments that may have contributed to her death in her early 50s. But even in death, Hatshepsut maintained her secrets. The mummy had been moved multiple times in antiquity, suggesting that even after her official erasure, someone, perhaps loyal priests or family members, continued to care for her remains. A small canopic jar bearing her name was found clutched in the mummy's hand, as if someone had wanted to ensure that future generations would know who she really was, even if her monuments lay in ruins. Long before Hatshepsut challenged gender conventions or Akhenaten revolutionized religion, another enigmatic figure had already established the template for pharaonic mystery that would endure for millennia. His name was Imhotep, and though he lived nearly 5,000 years ago, his legend has never truly died. To his contemporaries, he was the architect who built the first pyramid, the physician who could heal any ailment, and the wise man whose sayings were treasured by kings. To later generations of Egyptians, he became something even more remarkable, mortal man transformed into a god. The historical Imhotep lived during the 3rd dynasty, serving under Pharaoh Djoser in the 27th century before the Common Era. His titles, carved in hieroglyphs on the base of a statue of his royal master, read like a catalogue of human achievement. Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, first after the King of Upper Egypt, Administrator of the Great Palace, Hereditary, Lord, High Priest of Heliopolis, Builder, Chief Carpenter, chief sculptor, and maker of vases-in-chief. But it was as an architect that Imhotep achieved immortality. At Saqqara, in the shadow of the ancient capital of Memphis, he conceived and built the Step Pyramid, humanity's first monumental stone building. Before Imhotep, Egyptian tombs had been built of mud brick in low, rectangular structures called mastabas. What drove him to envision something completely different? What inspired him to stack 6 massive stone mastabas on top of each other, creating a structure that rose like a stairway to heaven? Standing before the Step Pyramid today, visitors can still feel the revolutionary audacity of Imhotep's vision. The monument rises in 6 distinct levels, each smaller than the one below, creating a silhouette that seems to lift the eye irresistibly toward the sky. The precision of the masonry is breathtaking, blocks of limestone fitted together so perfectly that a knife blade cannot slip between them. This was not merely architecture. It was a theological statement rendered in stone. The complex surrounding the pyramid reveals the full scope of Imhotep's genius. He didn't just build a tomb, he created an entire sacred city for the pharaohs. Afterlife, temples, courtyards, ceremonial buildings, and underground galleries spread across 37 acres, all enclosed within a limestone wall that stood over 30 feet high. Some of the buildings were purely symbolic solid stone facades with no interior space, designed not for the living but for the Ka, the spiritual double of the deceased pharaoh. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the Step Pyramid complex is its underground world. Beneath the monument, Imhotep's workers carved a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that extends more than a mile in total length. The burial chamber itself lies at the bottom of a shaft nearly 100 feet deep, accessible only through a maze of corridors designed to confuse grave robbers and protect the pharaoh's eternal rest. But the underground passages hold secrets beyond their protective function. The walls of some chambers are covered with thousands of blue-green faience tiles, creating rooms that shimmer like underwater caverns. Other walls bear the earliest known examples of pyramid text spells and incantations designed to guide the pharaoh through the afterlife. These aren't just decorative elements. They're components of an elaborate magical machine designed to ensure the king's transformation from mortal ruler to divine being. Archaeological evidence suggests that Imhotep's role extended far beyond architecture. Medical papyri from much later periods invoke his name as the patron of physicians, and the Greeks later identified him with their god of medicine, Asclepius. Did the same mind that conceived the Step Pyramid also advance the healing arts? Some scholars believe that Imhotep may have established the first medical school in history, training a generation of physicians whose knowledge would be passed down through centuries. The transformation of Imhotep from historical figure to divine being is one of the most remarkable examples of posthumous deification in ancient history. By the New Kingdom, over 1,000 years after his death, he was being worshipped as a god of wisdom and healing. Pilgrims traveled from across the Mediterranean world to seek his blessing at temples dedicated to his cult. Sick people slept in his sanctuaries, hoping for healing dreams. Scholars offered prayers to him before beginning important works. What's particularly fascinating is that unlike other deified mortals, Imhotep retained his human identity even as he achieved godhood. He was never mythologized into a figure of legend. Instead, he remained recognizably the historical architect, physician, and sage who had served Pharaoh Djoser. This suggests that his deification was based not on mythological stories, but on the continuing impact of his actual achievements. The mystery of Imhotep deepens when we consider that his tomb has never been found. Despite centuries of searching, archaeologists have never located the burial place of the man who invented pyramid building. Some believe it lies somewhere in the Saqqara necropolis, perhaps beneath one of the many unexcavated mastaba tombs that dot the ancient cemetery. Others speculate that he may have been buried in his own step pyramid complex, in a secret chamber that has yet to be discovered. Recent archaeological work at Saqqara has revealed tantalizing hints of Imhotep's continuing presence. Excavations have uncovered thousands of mummified ibis birds sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom with whom Imhotep was associated. These birds were apparently offerings left by pilgrims seeking the architect's favor. The sheer number of these mummified offerings suggests that the cult of Imhotep remained active well into the Roman period, more than 2 millennia after his death. But perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding Imhotep is not where he was buried or how he achieved divinity, but how he acquired the knowledge to build the step pyramid in the first place. The jump from mud brick mastabas to monumental stone architecture was not gradual, it was revolutionary. Did Imhotep have access to ancient knowledge that has since been lost? Did he receive divine inspiration, as later legends claimed? Or was he simply a genius whose insights into engineering, mathematics, and theology came together in one magnificent burst of creativity? The techniques used in the step pyramid's construction reveal a level of sophistication that seems to appear suddenly. In the archaeological record, the precise cutting of stone blocks, the understanding of structural engineering required to support such massive weight, the astronomical alignments that oriented the complex to celestial events, all of these suggest a level of technical knowledge that took generations to develop. Yet there are no obvious predecessors to Imhotep's work, no gradual evolution of technique that leads up to his achievement. Some researchers have suggested that Imhotep may have been working from much older architectural traditions that have left no surviving traces. Perhaps he was restoring or reinterpreting monuments that were already ancient in his time, translating structures originally built of perishable materials into eternal stone. This would explain both the sudden appearance of advanced techniques and the profoundly traditional elements that run through his design. The influence of Imhotep's innovation cannot be overstated. The step pyramid established the template for all subsequent pyramid building in Egypt. The smooth-sided pyramids of Giza, the elaborate pyramid complexes of the Middle Kingdom, even the revival of pyramid building in Sudan 2,000 years later, all can trace their ancestry back to Imhotep's revolutionary vision at Saqara. As the centuries wore on and Egypt's power waned, the memory of Imhotep's achievements took on an almost mythical quality. Islamic historians of the medieval period wrote of him as a sage whose wisdom surpassed that of all other men. European travelers of the Renaissance sought his tomb among the ruins of Memphis, hoping to uncover the secrets of ancient engineering. Even today, his name carries a resonance that few other figures from the ancient world can match. The step pyramid still stands at Saqqara, weathered by 47 centuries of wind and sand, but fundamentally intact. Visitors who climb to its summit can see the pyramids of Giza rising from the desert to the north, the monuments of later pharaohs who were inspired by Imhotep's vision. In the setting sun, when the limestone blocks glow golden against the darkening sky, it's easy to imagine the architect himself standing here, contemplating the eternal monument he had created, not just for his pharaoh, but for all humanity. Yet even now, the step pyramid keeps its secrets. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed anomalies beneath the structure that may indicate unknown chambers. Microscopic analysis of the mortar used in construction has yielded surprising results that challenge conventional understanding of ancient Egyptian technology. Each new discovery adds to the mystery rather than solving it, reminding us that Imhotep's greatest achievement may not have been what he built, but what he understood about the relationship between the mortal and the divine, the temporal and the eternal. In the end, Imhotep remains what he was in life, a figure who transcended the boundaries between human and divine, between the practical and the mystical. His monument still rises from the desert sands, a testament to the power of human vision and divine inspiration working in perfect harmony. As the ancient Egyptians understood, some achievements are so profound that they transform not just stone into architecture, but mortals into gods. The echoes of ancient wisdom carried forward through time, preserved in stone and memory, finding new voices in the rulers who would follow across the wind-dark sea from Egypt's sand-swept mysteries, where the last echoes of Akhenaten's hymns still whispered through abandoned temples. Another kind of wisdom was stirring. In the marble-bright cities of ancient Greece, where olive groves cast shadows upon paths worn smooth by countless sandaled feet, philosophers emerged like flames in the darkness, each one a keeper of secrets that would both illuminate and mystify the human soul for millennia to come. These were not merely teachers or scholars, but enigmatic figures who walked the boundary between the known and unknowable, between the rational and the divine, carrying within themselves riddles that would outlive empires. The morning mist rose from the harbor of Samos as Pythagoras walked among the shipbuilders and merchants, his mind already far from their concerns of cargo and coin. Born around 570 BCE, he was a figure who seemed to exist in multiple worlds simultaneously, and mystic, teacher and wanderer, rational philosopher and devotee of mysteries that predated Greek civilization itself. The islanders who watched him pass could not have known that this tall, bearded man, with eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient knowledge, would become one of history's most enigmatic figures, a philosopher whose very existence would blur the lines between fact and legend. Pythagoras had traveled extensively in his youth, drinking deeply from the wells of wisdom that lay scattered across the ancient world. He had sat with Egyptian priests in the shadow of pyramids, learning the sacred mathematics that governed the movement of stars and the harmony of creation. In Babylon, he had studied with magi who taught him that numbers were not mere tools of calculation, but living entities that held the keys to cosmic understanding. When he finally settled in Croton, in southern Italy, he brought with him a synthesis of knowledge that was both revolutionary and deeply rooted in ancient tradition. The school he founded was unlike any institution of learning that had come before. Part university, part mystery religion, part philosophical commune. It was a place where the boundaries between different forms of knowledge dissolved into something approaching the divine. Students who sought admission, they called themselves the Pythagoreans, were required to undergo years of preparation, learning to maintain perfect silence while they absorbed the foundational principles of their master's teaching. This silence was not merely discipline, but a form of sacred practice, a recognition that true wisdom could only be received by minds emptied of their own noise and preconceptions within the walls of the Pythagorean school. Mathematics became a form of theology. Numbers were not abstract concepts, but divine principles that manifested throughout creation. The number one represented unity, the source from which all things emerged. To embodied division and multiplicity, the principle that allowed the one to become many. 3 held within itself the mystery of return, the path by which the many could become one again. These were not philosophical abstractions, but lived realities, truths that could be experienced through contemplation and purification of the soul. The most famous of Pythagoras' discoveries, the mathematical relationship that bears his name, was understood by his followers not as a mere geometric principle, but as a revelation of cosmic harmony. The fact that the squares of the 2 shorter sides of a right triangle always equaled the square of the longest side was seen as evidence that the universe itself was built upon mathematical foundations, that number and proportion were the language in which the divine expressed itself in creation. But even this discovery was shrouded in mystery, for Pythagoras himself left no written works, and the knowledge was passed down only through oral tradition, layer upon layer of meaning that could only be understood by those who had been properly initiated. Perhaps no aspect of Pythagorean teaching captures the enigmatic nature of its founder more completely than his doctrine of the music of the spheres. Walking one evening along the shores of the Ionian Sea, listening to the waves crash against the rocks in their eternal rhythm, Pythagoras perceived something that would forever change how humanity understood its place in the cosmos. He heard, or claimed to hear, a vast symphony playing just beyond the threshold of normal human perception. The music created by the celestial bodies as they moved through their prescribed orbits around the earth. This was not metaphor or poetic fancy, but literal truth as Pythagoras understood it. Each planet, each star, vibrated at its own frequency as it traveled through the heavens, and these vibrations combined to create a cosmic harmony that was the foundation of all earthly music. The intervals between the planetary orbits corresponded. 2 musical intervals, sixths, fourths, creating a celestial scale that was both mathematically perfect and aesthetically sublime. Most humans could not hear this music, Pythagoras taught, because they had been surrounded by it from birth and had become deaf to its presence. Like those who live beside a waterfall and no longer notice its roar, but for those who had purified their souls through philosophy and mathematical contemplation, the music of the spheres could become audible, a divine symphony that revealed the true nature of reality. Pythagoras himself was said to possess this ability, and his students reported that he would sometimes pause in the middle of a lecture, his head tilted as if listening to sounds that they could not perceive. In these moments, they said, his face would take on an expression of such profound joy and understanding that they glimpsed something of the cosmic vision that drove their master's teaching. The implications of this doctrine were staggering. If the universe was indeed constructed as a vast musical instrument, then earthly music was not merely entertainment or artistic expression, but a participation in divine creation itself. The proper arrangement of tones and rhythms could heal. The soul could bring human consciousness into alignment with cosmic harmony, could even influence the course of events in the material world. Music became medicine, mathematics became magic, and the philosopher became a kind of cosmic tuner, adjusting the strings of human understanding to resonate with the eternal song of creation. Yet even as Pythagoras taught these sublime truths, he remained an enigma to those around him. Stories gathered around him like moths around a flame, each one adding another layer to the mystery of his true nature. Some said that he had been seen in multiple places at the same time, teaching simultaneously. In Croton and Metapontum, though, the cities were days apart by horseback. Others claimed that animals obeyed his voice, that he could command birds to change their flight patterns, or persuade bears to abandon their predation of cattle. A golden thigh was said to gleam through his robes, mark of his divine nature, though none could say whether this was literal truth or symbolic representation of his spiritual achievement. The most mysterious stories concerned his memory of previous lives. Pythagoras claimed to recall not just his current existence, but several previous incarnations, describing in detail events from earlier centuries and identifying objects that had belonged to him in former lifetimes. This was not mere philosophical speculation about reincarnation, but lived experience. Personal knowledge gained through the purification of consciousness that allowed the soul to remember its eternal journey through multiple embodiments. Death, for Pythagoras, was not an ending but a transformation. Like the mathematical relationship between different geometric forms, the essence remained constant even as the appearance changed. While Pythagoras developed his cosmic mathematics in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, another enigmatic figure was emerging in the bustling city of Ephesus. On the coast of Asia Minor, Heraclitus, who would come to be known as the Weeping Philosopher, presented a vision of reality so different from the harmonious universe of the Pythagoreans that it seemed to emerge from an entirely different cosmos. Where Pythagoras found eternal mathematical relationships, Heraclitus perceived constant change and flux. Where the Samian philosopher heard cosmic harmony, the Ephesian detected the thunder of endless conflict and transformation. Born into one of Ephesus's most aristocratic families around 535 BCE, Heraclitus could have lived a life of comfortable privilege, managing his inherited wealth and participating in the city's political life. Instead, he chose a path of radical philosophical inquiry that would make him one of the most misunderstood and influential thinkers in human history. He renounced his birthright, giving up his claim to the hereditary kingship of Ephesus, and devoted himself to contemplating the mysterious principles that governed the apparent chaos of existence. The citizens of Ephesus soon learned to recognize his solitary figure walking through their streets, always alone, always deep in thought, his face marked by an expression of profound sadness that gave him his nickname. He seemed to weep not from personal sorrow, but from a cosmic grief, as if he perceived some fundamental tragedy at the heart of existence that remained hidden from ordinary minds. When people approached him seeking conversation or wisdom, he would often respond with cryptic utterances that seemed designed more to confuse than to clarify, leading many to dismiss him as mad or deliberately obscure. But those who listened more carefully to Heraclitus's strange pronouncements began to detect patterns in his paradoxes, glimpses of a unified vision that was both terrible and beautiful in its implications. "You cannot step into the same river twice," he would say, watching the waters of the Cayster flow past the city walls toward the sea. But then he would add, as if the statement were incomplete, "You cannot step into the same river once," pushing his listeners to understand that change was so fundamental to reality that even the concept of stepping into a river even once assumed a stability that did not exist. This was not mere wordplay, but the articulation of a philosophical insight that would reverberate throughout Western thought for over 2 millennia. Heraclitus had perceived that what humans experienced as solid, permanent reality was actually a dynamic process of constant transformation. Everything that existed was caught up in an eternal flux, a cosmic fire that consumed and renewed all things in an endless cycle of creation and destruction. The table at which a person ate breakfast was not the same table at which they ate dinner, for every atom in it had been touched by change. The person who sat at the table was similarly transformed from moment to moment, their body replacing its cells, their mind shifting through new thoughts and feelings. their soul evolving through new experiences. Yet within this vision of universal flux, Heraclitus detected a hidden stability, a logos or divine reason that governed the process of change itself. Like a river that maintains its identity despite the constant flow of new water. The cosmos preserved its essential character through the very process of transformation. The path up and down are one and the same, he taught, meaning that what appeared to be opposite movements, creation and destruction, life and death, joy and sorrow, were actually aspects of a single cosmic process that transcended human categories. Of understanding, this logos was not a personal deity, but something more mysterious, an impersonal intelligence that manifested through the tension of opposites. Day existed only in relationship to night. Hot gained meaning only in contrast to cold. War achieved significance only when balanced against peace. These opposites did not simply coexist, but actually required each other, creating a dynamic tension that was the source of all creativity and change. War is the father and king of all, Heraclitus declared, not because he loved conflict, but because he recognized that creative tension was the fundamental principle of cosmic evolution. The more Heraclitus contemplated these mysteries, the more he became convinced that most of humanity lived in a kind of waking sleep, mistaking the shadows of constant change for permanent reality. People built their lives around the assumption that things would remain stable, their relationships, their possessions, their beliefs, their very identities. But this assumption was not merely incorrect. It was the source of much human suffering. When the inevitable changes came, people experienced them as violations of the natural order rather than expressions of the cosmic principle that governed all existence. The wisdom that Heraclitus offered was both simple and impossibly difficult. To align oneself with the logos, to live in accordance with the principle of change rather than in resistance to it. This required a fundamental transformation of consciousness, a willingness to release attachment to fixed ideas and identities and to flow with the cosmic fire that was constantly renewing all things. Such wisdom could not be taught through conventional instruction, but had to be kindled within each individual through their own contemplation and experience. This is why Heraclitus expressed his insights in the form of cryptic aphorisms and paradoxical statements that have puzzled readers for over 2,000 years. The way up and down are one and the same. A man's character is his destiny. Nothing is permanent except change. The sun is new each day. These were not philosophical arguments in the conventional sense, but meditative triggers designed to provoke insight rather than to convey information. Like riddles from an ancient oracle, they were meant to be lived with and contemplated until they're hidden. Meaning suddenly blazed forth in a moment of understanding as Heraclitus grew older. His reputation for wisdom spread throughout the Greek world, but he seemed to take little pleasure in his fame. He became increasingly reclusive, spending long periods in the mountains outside Ephesus, contemplating the cosmic fire in solitude. When visitors sought him out, they often found him sitting beside a simple hearth, staring into the flames with an expression of such intense concentration that they hesitated to interrupt his meditation. Here too, he would say when he noticed their presence, "The gods are present," a reminder that the divine principle he taught was not remote from ordinary experience, but manifested in every moment of existence, even in the humble fire that warmed his dwelling. The stories that surrounded his death are as enigmatic as those that marked his life. Some said that he developed dropsy, a swelling of the body caused by excess fluid, and that he cured himself by burying his body in cow dung. believing that the heat would draw out the moisture, a treatment that proved fatal. Others claimed that he simply walked into the mountains one day and never returned, merging with the cosmic fire that he had spent his life contemplating. Still others insisted that he had not died at all, but had achieved a kind of conscious dissolution, his individual identity flowing back into the logos that governed all things, while his essential being remained intact. Whether any of these stories contain literal truth matters less than what they reveal about how Heraclitus was perceived by his contemporaries and successors. He had become something more than a philosopher. He was a living embodiment of the cosmic principle he taught, a human being who had so fully aligned himself with the process of change that his very existence became a teaching about the nature of reality. Long after his physical presence had vanished from the streets of Ephesus, his influence continued to flow through the currents of Western thought, shaping the understanding of countless thinkers who found in his paradoxes a key to unlocking mysteries that conventional logic could not penetrate. In the Greek city of on the southern coast of Sicily, another extraordinary figure was developing a vision of reality that would synthesize and transcend the insights of both Pythagoras and Heraclitus. Empedocles, born around 494 BCE into a wealthy and politically prominent family, seemed destined for a career in public life. Indeed, he did achieve considerable fame as a physician, politician, and democratic reformer, earning a reputation throughout Sicily for his healing abilities and his efforts to establish more equitable forms of government. But like so many of the enigmatic figures of ancient philosophy, his deepest allegiance was to mysteries that transcended the ordinary concerns of human society. Empedocles possessed a gift for perceiving the hidden connections that linked all phenomena, from the smallest grain of sand to the grandest celestial movements. Where others saw separate and unrelated objects, he detected the play of fundamental principles that manifested throughout the cosmos in countless different forms. This vision led him to propose a theory of reality that was both elegantly simple and profoundly mysterious. Everything that existed was composed of four eternal elements: earth, air, fire, and water, that combined and separated under the influence of two cosmic forces he called love and strife. These were not merely physical elements in the modern sense, but archetypal principles that embodied different aspects of cosmic creativity. Earth represented solidity and endurance, the principle that gave form and structure to manifested reality. Water embodied fluidity and receptivity, the capacity to adapt and flow that allowed for transformation and growth. Air symbolized movement and communication, the medium through which different elements could interact. But the true genius of Empedocles' vision lay in his understanding of the forces that governed the relationships between these elements. Love was not merely an emotion, but a cosmic principle of attraction and harmony that drew different elements together into increasingly complex and beautiful forms. Under love's influence, earth and water might combine to create fertile soil. Air and fire might merge to generate the lightning that brought life-giving rain, and all four elements might unite in the intricate patterns that constituted living beings. Strife, by contrast, was the principle of separation and individuation that prevented love from merging everything into an undifferentiated unity. Without strife, Empedocles taught, the cosmos would collapse into a static perfection in which no change or development could occur. It was strife that separated the elements from each other, creating the differences and tensions that made possible the rich diversity of phenomena that constituted the world of experience. But strife without love would result in complete fragmentation. a universe of isolated particles with no capacity for relationship or creative interaction. The interplay of these two forces created a cosmic rhythm that Empedocles described in terms that were both scientific and mythological. During periods when love dominated, the elements would be drawn together into increasingly complex combinations, creating the rich diversity of natural forms that populated the earth. Plants and animals would flourish, human civilization would advance, and the cosmos would achieve new levels of beauty and harmony. But inevitably, the influence of strife would begin to assert itself, gradually separating the elements and dissolving the complex structures that love had created. This was not a process of decline or corruption, but a necessary phase in the cosmic cycle. For only through separation could the elements be prepared for new combinations that would surpass in creativity and beauty anything that had existed before. Like the in-breath and out-breath of a cosmic being, the alternation of love and strife created a vast rhythm that extended across enormous periods of time, with each phase contributing to the eternal dance of creation and dissolution that was the fundamental nature of reality. What distinguished Empedocles from other philosophers of his time was his ability to translate these cosmic insights into practical applications that could benefit human life. As a physician, he understood that illness was often the result of disharmony between the elements that constituted the human body, and his treatments were designed to restore the proper balance between earth, air, fire, and water. But his medicine was not merely physical. He recognized that the human being was a microcosm of the larger cosmos, and that true healing required attention to the spiritual and emotional dimensions of existence, as well as the purely physical. His reputation as a healer spread throughout the Greek world, and stories of miraculous cures began to accumulate around his name. It was said that he could revive those who had been given up for dead, that he could heal not only bodily ailments, but mental and spiritual disorders as well. Some of these accounts may have been exaggerated, but they point to a genuine therapeutic gift that seemed to operate through principles that conventional medicine could not explain. Empedocles appeared to possess an intuitive understanding of the hidden connections that linked mind and body, individual and cosmos, that allowed him to address the root causes of illness, rather than merely treating its symptoms. But even as he gained fame as a physician and public figure, Empedocles was developing insights that went far beyond the concerns of ordinary medical practice. He had become convinced that the same cosmic principles that governed the mixing and separation of elements in the physical world also applied to the realm of consciousness and spiritual development. The human soul, he taught, was itself composed of the four elements, but in proportions and combinations that were far more refined than those found in ordinary matter. During its embodied existence, the soul was subject to the same forces of love and strife that governed the physical cosmos, but at a level of subtlety that was normally invisible to ordinary awareness. Under the influence of love, the soul's elements could achieve harmonious integration, resulting in states of consciousness characterized by wisdom, compassion, and creative insight. Under the dominance of strife, these same elements would separate and conflict with each other, producing confusion, emotional turmoil, and spiritual blindness. Most remarkably, Empedocles claimed to remember his own soul's journey through multiple incarnations, each one teaching him more about the cosmic principles that governed existence. He had been, he said, a boy and a girl, a bush and a bird, and a silent fish in the sea. These were not mere poetic metaphors, but literal descriptions of the soul's evolution through different forms of life, each one providing unique opportunities for learning and development. The goal of this vast educational process was the soul's eventual liberation from the cycle of birth and death, its conscious reunion with the cosmic love that was the source and destination of all existence. This teaching about reincarnation and spiritual evolution was not merely theoretical for Empedocles, but lived knowledge that informed every aspect of his daily life. He became a vegetarian, refusing to participate in animal sacrifice or to eat the flesh of beings he recognized as fellow souls on the path of cosmic development. He spoke to animals as equals, claiming that he could understand their languages and perceive their individual struggles and aspirations. His compassion extended even to plants, which he understood to be embodied souls at an earlier stage of development than animals and humans. As his understanding deepened, Empedocles began to clothe himself in the manner of ancient priests and prophets, wearing purple robes and golden sandals, crowning his head with wreaths of laurel that marked his status as one who had been initiated into cosmic mysteries. This was not vanity or theatrical display, but an outward expression of an inner transformation that had aligned him with principles that transcended ordinary human identity. He had become, in his own understanding, a living representative of the cosmic love that sought to reunite all separated elements into their original unity. The stories surrounding Empedocles' final destiny are among the most dramatic and mysterious in ancient philosophy. According to one account, he climbed to the summit of Mount Etna, the great volcano that dominated eastern Sicily, and leaped into the crater as a demonstration of his divine nature and his power over the elements. Others claimed that he was translated directly into the realm of the gods, his physical body dissolving into the cosmic fire, while his consciousness merged with the eternal principles he had spent his life contemplating. Still, another tradition insisted that he had not died at all, but continued to wander the earth in various forms, appearing to his former students and followers as an immortal teacher who had transcended the limitations of ordinary existence. These stories, whether literally true or symbolically intended, point to something unprecedented in the ancient world's understanding of human possibility. Empedocles had claimed not merely to understand cosmic principles intellectually, but to embody them so completely that the boundaries between human and divine consciousness had dissolved. He had become a living bridge between the world of ordinary experience and the realm of eternal truth, demonstrating through his own transformation the ultimate goal of philosophical inquiry, not merely to know the truth, but to become it. The wisdom of these enigmatic figures, Pythagoras with his cosmic mathematics, Heraclitus with his doctrine of flux, Empedocles with his fourfold vision, would continue to flow through the underground streams of Western consciousness long after the classical world had crumbled into dust. Their insights would resurface in medieval alchemy, Renaissance Hermeticism, and modern depth psychology, each new generation discovering in their teachings keys to mysteries that remained as relevant and compelling as ever. But in their own time, they represented something unprecedented, human beings who had pushed the boundaries of consciousness itself, exploring territories of understanding that lay beyond the reach of ordinary thought and ordinary language. As the shadows lengthened across the marble courtyards of their ancient schools, as the olive groves whispered their eternal secrets to the Mediterranean wind, these philosophers had glimpsed something that would forever change humanity's understanding of its place in the cosmos. They had seen that the universe was not a collection of separate objects, but a living whole animated by principles of intelligence, creativity, and love that were accessible to human consciousness when properly prepared and purified. Their legacy was not merely a collection of theories or doctrines, but a lived demonstration that human beings were capable of participating, consciously in the cosmic processes that created and sustained all existence. All existence could interact and influence each other. Fire manifested energy and purification, the force that dissolved existing forms to make way for new creations. In the gentle twilight of these ancient teachings, where mathematics became music and philosophy became prayer, the eternal questions that drive all genuine inquiry continued to whisper their patient summons to anyone willing to listen. What is the true nature of reality? How is human consciousness related to cosmic intelligence? What possibilities lie hidden within the depths of existence, waiting to be discovered by those brave enough to venture beyond the familiar shores of ordinary understanding? The enigmatic figures of ancient Greece had not answered these questions, so much as lived them, transforming themselves into living answers that continued to inspire and challenge all who encountered their mysterious legacy. The last philosophers of the Library of Alexandria moved through corridors that had once echoed with the voices of the greatest minds in human history. Their footsteps, now the only sound disturbing centuries of accumulated silence. These final guardians of ancient wisdom carried within their aging minds the distilled essence of knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate, knowledge that would soon vanish like smoke in the Mediterranean wind. Theon of Alexandria, mathematician and philosopher, father to the brilliant Hypatia, spent his final years not in celebration of discovery, but in the desperate task of preservation. His weathered hands, stained with ink from countless manuscripts, worked by candlelight to copy and hide the most precious texts. He had witnessed the growing tensions between the old world of learning and the new world of religious fervor, and he understood with crystalline clarity that an age was ending. In those twilight years of the 4th century, as shadows lengthened across the ancient world, Theon would often pause in his copying to stare at the vast halls of the library. Once, these spaces had housed nearly 700,000 scrolls, the accumulated wisdom of Egypt, Greece, Rome, Persia, and India. Scholars had traveled from the edges of the known world to study here, to debate, to learn, to contribute their own discoveries to the great conversation of human knowledge. Now, many of the shelves stood empty. Some scrolls had been deliberately destroyed by those who saw ancient wisdom as a threat to new faith. Others had simply crumbled with age, their papyrus turning to dust, their words disappearing into the air like whispered prayers. The great catalogue system, once the marvel of the ancient world, had become a monument to loss. Its careful organization pointing to empty spaces where irreplaceable knowledge had once resided. But Theon was not alone in his vigil. Throughout the fading Roman Empire, other guardians maintained their silent watch. In the libraries of Constantinople, scholars worked to preserve Greek philosophical texts, translating them into Latin before the original language skills were lost. In the monasteries of Ireland, Celtic monks copied classical texts alongside religious manuscripts, often without fully understanding the pagan wisdom they were preserving for future generations. In the East, the scholars of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad had become the inheritors of much that was being lost in the West. Islamic scholars, building upon Greek, Persian, and Indian foundations, were not merely preserving ancient knowledge, but expanding upon it. Yet even they sensed the weight of what was disappearing. The great translator Hanan ibn Ishaq spoke of racing against time, of trying to save texts that were vanishing even as he worked to render them into Arabic. The story of these final guardians is not merely one of preservation, but of transformation. As the old world crumbled, knowledge itself had to change form to survive. The oral traditions, that had once been scorned by literate scholars suddenly became precious vessels for ancient wisdom. In Ireland, the Philid, the hereditary poet-scholars, carried in their memories not just Celtic lore but fragments of classical learning that had somehow made its way to the western edge of Europe. In the high mountains of Tibet, another kind of preservation was taking place. Buddhist monasteries had become repositories for Indian, philosophical and mathematical texts that were being destroyed in their homeland by successive waves of invasion and conquest. The monks who copied these Sanskrit manuscripts often worked in silence, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Their dedication absolute even when they could not read the languages they were preserving. These Tibetan guardians understood that they were not merely copying texts, but maintaining threads of connection to a vanishing world. The mathematical treatises of Aryabhata, the philosophical dialogues of Nagarjuna, the astronomical calculations of Brahmagupta found refuge in mountain monasteries where they would wait centuries for rediscovery. The weight of this responsibility pressed heavily upon those who understood its full significance. They knew that with each passing day, more knowledge was being lost forever. Languages were dying, taking with them entire ways of understanding the world. The last speakers of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic writing had long since vanished, leaving behind temples covered in inscriptions that no living person could read. The astronomical knowledge of the Babylonians, accumulated over millennia of careful observation, survived only in fragments. Its full significance lost to those who came after Dot, in the mist-shrouded forests of ancient Britain and Gaul. The final Druids gathered in sacred groves that had witnessed centuries of accumulated wisdom. These enigmatic figures, who had never committed their deepest knowledge to writing, now faced the extinction of an entire way of understanding the world. Their oral traditions, passed down through generations of careful memorization, contained not just religious beliefs, but sophisticated understanding of astronomy, medicine, law, and natural philosophy. The Roman conquest had scattered the Druidic schools, but small communities persisted in remote places, hidden from the eyes of those who would destroy them. In these final sanctuaries, the last Druids performed their most sacred duty, the preservation of memory itself. They understood that once their voices fell silent, an entire civilization's worth of knowledge would vanish as completely as if it had never existed. Divicicus, whom Caesar had mentioned in his writings as the most learned of the Gallic Druids, had foreseen this ending. In his final years, he had attempted something unprecedented in Druidic tradition. He had begun to set down, in writing, some of the astronomical calculations that had been passed down through generations of oral teaching. His fellow Druids were horrified by this violation of ancient custom. But Divicicus understood that desperate times required desperate measures. The manuscripts he created were hidden in caves throughout the Celtic lands, buried beneath stone. Altars, sealed in metal containers and placed in sacred wells. Most would never be found. The Druids who knew their locations died without revealing the secrets, taking the knowledge to their graves rather than risk its discovery by Roman forties or Christian missionaries who would have destroyed it. As pagan corruption, what little survived of Druidic knowledge came through the most unlikely of channels. Roman soldiers, posted to Celtic lands for years, sometimes formed relationships with local communities and learned fragments of the old law. Christian missionaries, even as they worked to convert the pagan peoples, occasionally recorded elements of what they sought to replace, preserving through condemnation what might otherwise have been entirely lost. In Ireland, where Roman rule had never taken hold, the Druidic tradition lingered longer and transformed more gradually. The The arrival of Christianity created not immediate destruction, but a complex blending of old and new knowledge. Irish monks, many of whom came from families that had served the old religion, incorporated elements of Druidic lore into their Christian learning. The result was a unique synthesis that preserved fragments of ancient Celtic wisdom within the structure of medieval Christian scholarship. The Sentius Mare, the great Irish law code, contained legal principles that stretched back to pre-Christian times. The astronomical calculations found in Irish manuscripts showed clear influence of Druidic star lore. Even the distinctive illuminated manuscripts produced in Irish monasteries incorporated artistic motifs that had their roots in the symbolic language of the Druids, but this was preservation through transformation, and much was inevitably lost in the process. The Druids had possessed detailed knowledge of herbal medicine, of the properties of different plants and their uses in healing. They had understood the movement of celestial bodies and could predict eclipses and seasonal changes with remarkable accuracy. They had developed sophisticated legal systems that governed complex Celtic societies. All of this knowledge was embedded in oral traditions that required not just memorization, but deep understanding of interconnected systems of meaning. When the last Druids died, they took with them not just specific information, but entire ways of seeing and understanding the world. Their knowledge was holistic, interconnected, woven together in patterns that could not be easily separated into the discrete categories that later scholarship would require. A Druidic understanding of astronomy was inseparable from their understanding of agriculture, of law, of medicine, of poetry. To lose one aspect was to damage the whole, and as the tradition fragmented, its full meaning became impossible to recover. The silence that fell over the sacred groves was more than the absence of human voices. It was the silencing of an entire way of knowing, a complete worldview that had developed over centuries of careful observation and philosophical reflection. The stones that had witnessed Druidic rituals stood mute, unable to convey the knowledge that had once flowed around them like water. In the jungles of the Yucatan, where pyramids rose like geometric mountains above the forest canopy, the final Mayan astronomers maintained their vigil over calendars that stretched into deep time. These scholar priests, inheritors of mathematical and astronomical traditions that had flourished for over 1,000 years, worked in cities that were slowly being reclaimed by the jungle, their great stone observatories gradually disappearing beneath vines and centuries of accumulated earth. The collapse of classical Mayan civilization had been gradual but inexorable. Great cities like Tikal and Kolokmol, once centers of learning that rivaled any in the ancient world, had been abandoned not through conquest, but through a complex combination of environmental change, political upheaval, and social transformation that scholars would still be debating centuries later. What remained were smaller communities scattered throughout the region, where the old knowledge persisted in increasingly fragmentary form. Itzamnahad Be'alam, the last great astronomer priest of Kop, spent his final years not in the grand observatory that had made his city famous, but in a small stone chamber hidden deep within the jungle. Here, by the light of pine torches, he continued the calculations that his predecessors had begun centuries earlier, tracking the movements of Venus, predicting eclipses, maintaining the intricate calendar systems that governed Mayan understanding of time and existence. The knowledge he preserved was staggering in its sophistication. Mayan astronomers had calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern measurements. They had tracked the movements of Venus with such precision that their calculations remained accurate for centuries. They had developed a mathematical system that included the concept of zero independently of any contact with the Old World. Their calendar was more accurate than the Julian calendar being used in Europe at the same time. But this knowledge was encoded in systems of writing and numerical notation that were becoming increasingly rare. The Mayan script, one of the most sophisticated writing systems ever developed in the Americas, required years of study to master. It combined logographic and syllabic elements in ways that allowed for incredible precision of expression. But this very sophistication made it vulnerable. As the educational systems that had produced literate scribes collapsed, the ability to read and write in Mayan hieroglyphs began to disappear. Itzamni Balam and his contemporaries faced a terrible choice. They could attempt to preserve their knowledge in its traditional form, maintaining the complex symbolic systems that had evolved over centuries, knowing that fewer and fewer people would be able to understand them, or they could try to translate their learning into simpler formats. Losing much of the subtlety and interconnectedness that made Mayan knowledge so remarkable, many chose preservation over accessibility. In hidden caches throughout the Mayan lands, they buried codices containing astronomical tables, mathematical calculations, historical records, and religious texts. These bark paper books represented the distilled wisdom of centuries, but they were written in scripts that would become increasingly difficult to decipher as the tradition that had created them faded away. The irony was profound. The Mayan codices that survived were marvels of intellectual achievement, containing knowledge that would not be matched in some areas until the development of modern astronomy and mathematics. Yet they remained largely inaccessible, their secrets locked away by the very sophistication that made them so valuable. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 16th century, they encountered the final remnants of this ancient intellectual tradition. Some Mayan communities still maintained astronomical knowledge, could still predict eclipses and track the movements of celestial bodies, but much had already been lost, and the violent disruption of conquest completed the destruction that internal collapse had begun. Diego de Landa, the Spanish bishop who famously burned Mayan books as works of the devil, later attempted to document Mayan culture and learning. His efforts, well-intentioned but deeply flawed, preserved fragments of knowledge, even as they recorded its destruction. His account of Mayan writing, though incomplete and sometimes inaccurate, would prove crucial to later attempts at decipherment. But by the time he wrote his description, most of the scribes who could have corrected his errors were already dead. The last Mayan astronomers died in obscurity, their names unrecorded by history. They had maintained ancient traditions through generations of political upheaval and social change, adapting their knowledge to new circumstances while preserving its essential core. But they could not adapt to the complete destruction of the intellectual framework within which their learning existed. When that framework collapsed, their knowledge became as inaccessible as if it had been written in the languages of another planet. In the narrow workshops that clung to the shadows of Alexandria's great library, the last alchemists tended fires that had burned continuously for centuries. These inheritors of Hellenistic learning worked in secrecy, their laboratories hidden from the eyes of those who would have condemned their research as dangerous or heretical. They were the final practitioners of an art that sought to understand the fundamental nature of matter itself, pursuing knowledge that bridged the gap between physical experimentation and spiritual transformation. Zosimos of Panopolis, perhaps the most famous of the late alchemists, had established principles that his successors followed for generations. His vision of alchemy as both practical chemistry and spiritual discipline created a tradition that was simultaneously scientific and mystical, rational and intuitive. The alchemists who worked in Alexandria's twilight years inherited not just his techniques, but his understanding that the transformation of base metals into gold was inseparable from the transformation of the human soul. Stephanos of Alexandria, active in the 7th century, was among the last to work openly in the ancient tradition. His commentaries on alchemical texts revealed a sophisticated understanding of chemical processes, combined with deep knowledge of Platonic philosophy. He wrote of distillation and sublimation with the precision of a modern chemist, while simultaneously exploring the symbolic meanings of these operations in terms of human spiritual development. But even as Stephanos worked, the intellectual environment that had nurtured alchemy was disappearing. The Library of Alexandria had been in decline for centuries, its collections scattered, its scholars dispersed. The rise of Christianity had created suspicion toward practices that seemed to challenge divine authority over the natural world. Islamic conquest brought new rulers who, while more tolerant of learning than their predecessors, favored different approaches to natural philosophy. The final alchemists understood that their tradition was dying. They responded by creating increasingly elaborate systems of symbolic encryption, encoding their knowledge in language so obscure that only the most dedicated students could hope to understand it. Their manuscripts became labyrinths of allegory and metaphor, where chemical processes were described in terms of mythological narratives, where the properties of metals were explained through astrological correspondences, where practical procedures were hidden within elaborate philosophical speculations. This encryption was both preservation and self-destruction. It protected alchemical knowledge from those who would suppress it, but it also made that knowledge increasingly inaccessible to future generations. The symbolic language that had originally served to illuminate hidden connections between different aspects of reality became so complex that it obscured the very insights it was meant to preserve. Maria the Jewess, the legendary alchemist whose name survives in the term bain-marie, had established principles of chemical apparatus that remained in use for centuries. Her water bath, her keratochus for gentle heating, her tribicos for distillation, these practical innovations were based on deep understanding of how heat and moisture affected different substances. But by the time of the final Alexandrian alchemists, such practical knowledge was being overwhelmed by increasingly esoteric theoretical frameworks. The last practitioners worked alone, their laboratories becoming more like hermitages than centers of collaborative research. They spent years perfecting single operations, seeking not just chemical transformation, but personal enlightenment through their work. Their manuscripts, when they chose to write at all, became deeply personal documents, recording not just experimental procedures, but spiritual insights gained through laboratory practice. When Islamic scholars encountered these final alchemical traditions, they found both treasure and frustration. The practical knowledge contained in alchemical texts proved invaluable for developing new chemical techniques. Islamic alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan built upon Alexandrian foundations to create sophisticated theories of chemical composition and reaction. But much of the symbolic language remained impenetrable, requiring years of study to decode even simple procedures. The irony was that alchemy's greatest strength, its integration of practical and theoretical knowledge, became the source of its decline as natural philosophy divided into discrete disciplines. There was no place for a tradition that refused to separate chemistry from psychology, physics from metaphysics, experimentation from spiritual practice. The holistic worldview that had given alchemy its power became a liability in an intellectual environment that demanded specialized expertise. The final alchemists took their secrets to their graves, not through malice, but through the simple impossibility of transmitting complex, integrated knowledge to students who lacked the philosophical framework necessary to understand it. Their laboratories fell silent, their furnaces grew cold, their manuscripts became curiosities collected by antiquarians who valued them more for their age than for their content. Yet something survived. The practical techniques pioneered by alchemists became foundational to later chemistry. Their careful observations of chemical reactions, recorded even within elaborate symbolic narratives, proved invaluable to future researchers. Their understanding that matter could be transformed through controlled application of heat, moisture, and other agents laid the groundwork for modern chemical theory. More subtly, their vision of knowledge as simultaneously practical and spiritual. Their understanding that the investigation of nature was inseparable from self-understanding influenced later traditions of natural philosophy. The idea that scientific knowledge should serve human transformation as well as practical utility would resurface again and again in the history of learning, even when its alchemical origins were forgotten. The silence that fell over the alchemical laboratories of Alexandria was different from the silence that ended other ancient traditions. It was not the silence of destruction, but the silence of transformation. Itself the necessary quiet that precedes the emergence of new forms of knowledge from the dissolution of old ones. In that silence, ancient wisdom did not disappear, but changed state, like one of the chemical substances the alchemists had studied so carefully, waiting for the right conditions to manifest in new and unexpected forms. And in that profound quiet, as the last flames flickered in abandoned laboratories and the final manuscripts gathered dust in forgotten chambers, the ancient world's long conversation with mystery drew toward its close, preparing for the great transformation that would carry human knowledge across the bridge of centuries into forms yet unimagined. Time moved like water through cupped hands, and the shadows of the ancient world began to lengthen into something recognizable as history. The figures who had walked in mystery, who had whispered secrets to the stars and carved their names into the bones of the earth, found themselves transformed not by death, but by memory. Their stories, once living breath, became something else, entirely echoes that would reverberate through corridors of time they could never have imagined. In the libraries of Alexandria, before the flames came to claim them, scribes worked by lamplight, their reed pens scratching against papyrus as they tried to capture the essence of those who had already begun to fade into legend. They wrote of Imhotep, not as the man who had once stood in the shadow of the step pyramid, calculating angles and speaking with physicians about the mysteries of the human heart, but as something larger, a figure of wisdom so profound that it seemed to transcend the boundaries of mortal understanding. The ink dried, the scrolls were rolled, and the transformation was complete. The man became the myth. But myths, unlike men, have a curious relationship with truth. They grow in the telling, gathering details like snowflakes accumulating on a winter branch, each edition both beautiful and potentially obscuring. The real Imhotep, the one who had perhaps worried about the stability of his architectural innovations, or felt the weight of royal expectations pressing down upon his shoulders, became something else in the retelling. He became the perfect sage, the master of all knowledge, the bridge between mortal understanding and divine wisdom. The human complexity was smoothed away, leaving only the gleaming surface of perfection. The Greeks took these inherited stories and made them their own, as all cultures do with the wisdom of their predecessors. Hermes Trismegistus emerged from this cultural alchemy, a figure who bore the features of both the Egyptian Thoth and the Greek Hermes, yet belonged fully to neither. He was a creation of the spaces between civilizations, born in the liminal moments when one way of understanding the world gave way to another. In the manuscripts that would later bear his name, he spoke with a voice that seemed to echo from the very foundations of creation itself. The Hermetic texts that emerged in the centuries following the fall of pharaonic Egypt carried within them the distilled essence of countless forgotten conversations. Somewhere in their intricate philosophical spirals lay the ghost of an ancient priest explaining the relationship between the movements of celestial bodies and the stirrings of the human soul. Somewhere in their alchemical formulas rested the memory of a physician mixing compounds in a temple laboratory, seeking not just to heal the body, but to understand the very nature of transformation itself. These texts traveled through time like seeds on the wind, taking root in the most unexpected places. In medieval monasteries, Christian monks copied the words of the thrice great Hermes with the same devotion they brought to the Gospels, finding in the ancient wisdom something that complemented rather than contradicted their faith. The boundaries between pagan and Christian, between ancient and medieval, became permeable in the quiet hours when a scribe worked by candlelight, his hand moving across parchment as he preserved knowledge that had already traveled across continents and centuries. The Renaissance humanists discovered these texts like treasure hunters stumbling upon a buried hoard. To Marsilio Ficino, translating the Corpus Hermeticum in 15th century Florence, the words seemed to carry the breath of antiquity itself. He believed he was touching something that predated Moses, that reached back to the very dawn of human wisdom. The historical reality that these texts were likely composed in the early centuries of the Common Era mattered less than the truth they seemed to contain. They spoke of a universe that was alive, interconnected, responsive to human understanding and intention. They offered a vision of knowledge that was both mystical and practical, both divine and thoroughly human. In the manuscript traditions of medieval Europe, other figures from the ancient world underwent similar transformations. Pythagoras, who had once been a flesh-and-blood philosopher walking the dusty roads of southern Italy, became a figure of such mathematical perfection that his actual teachings were almost beside the point. The stories that accumulated around his name, the golden thigh, the ability to communicate with animals, the previous lives as various heroes and sages created a mythological figure who embodied the very idea of mystical mathematics. The real Pythagoras had probably struggled with the same challenges that face any teacher: how to communicate complex ideas to students of varying abilities, how to maintain the coherence of a philosophical community, how to balance the demands of intellectual pursuit with the practical necessities of daily life. But the Pythagoras of legend transcended all such mundane concerns. He became the perfect master, the one who had achieved complete harmony between mathematical understanding and spiritual insight. The human teacher disappeared, leaving only the archetype of wisdom. When the Renaissance scholars turned their attention to these ancient figures, they brought with them both genuine reverence and inevitable misunderstanding. They possessed fragments, scattered texts, partial translations, references in later authors. From these fragments they attempted to reconstruct entire philosophical systems. It was like trying to restore a shattered mosaic when most of the pieces had been lost to time and weather. The result was something new, something that belonged as much to the 15th and 16th centuries as it did to antiquity. Pico della Mirandola, in his passionate youth, believed he could synthesize all human wisdom into a single, coherent system. The ancient figures became chess pieces in his grand intellectual game, each one representing a different aspect of the universal truth he was certain existed. Hermes provided the mystical foundation, Pythagoras contributed the mathematical structure, the Chaldean oracles offered prophetic insight, and the Kabbalah revealed the secret architecture of creation itself. It was a magnificent vision, and its very impossibility seemed to make it more rather than less compelling. The actual historical figures, the Egyptian priests, the Greek philosophers, the Persian magi would hardly have recognized themselves. In these Renaissance reconstructions, they had been transformed by centuries of transmission, translation, and reinterpretation into something that served the needs of a different age. The Renaissance required ancient authority for its innovations, and so it created ancient authorities who could provide exactly the kind of validation that was needed. The circle was complete. The present shaped the past, which in turn justified the present. This process of creative misunderstanding was not unique to the Renaissance. Every age has reimagined its predecessors in its own image, finding in the past exactly what it needed to discover. The Romantic poets of the 19th century found in ancient mystery religions a critique of their own industrializing world. The psychologists of the 20th century found in the same materials evidence for universal patterns of human consciousness. Each interpretation revealed as much about the interpreters as it did about the original sources. The development of modern archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries brought with it both revelation and disillusionment. The spades and brushes of careful excavation began to uncover the actual material remains of the ancient world. And these remains told stories that were often quite different from the ones that had been preserved in the literary tradition. The Egypt that emerged from archaeological investigation was more complex, more human, and in many ways more interesting than the land of perfect wisdom that had been imagined by generations of philosophers and mystics. Imhotep's name was found carved in stone, but not as the divine sage of later legend. He appeared in the archaeological record as what he had always been, a remarkably talented individual who had served his pharaoh with skill and dedication. His tomb, when it was finally discovered, revealed a man who had been honored in his own time but who had become something far greater in the collective memory of his civilization. The gap between the historical person and the legendary figure became visible, and with that visibility came both loss and gain. The loss was the comfortable certainty that had come with the legendary versions, the perfect sage, the flawless master of all wisdom, proved to be as fictional as any character in a novel. But the gain was something more precious. The recognition that the real achievement of figures like Imhotep was not that they had transcended human limitations, but that they had worked within those limitations to create something extraordinary. The human dimension made their accomplishments more rather than less remarkable. Similar revelations emerged from excavations throughout the ancient world. The Pythagoras who emerged from careful historical analysis was a more modest but ultimately more impressive figure than the supernatural sage of legend. The real man had founded a philosophical community that had struggled with the same internal tensions that afflict all human organizations. He had developed mathematical insights that were genuinely significant, but he had done so through patient observation and logical reasoning rather than divine revelation. The human teacher proved to be more inspiring than the mythical figure had ever been. Yet even as archaeology was revealing the human dimensions of these ancient figures, another process was simultaneously at work. The very act of archaeological discovery was creating new myths, new stories about the ancient world that served the psychological needs of modern people. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 captured the popular imagination not just because of the material treasures it contained, but because it seemed to offer a glimpse into a world where mystery and beauty was still possible. The young pharaoh became a symbol of lost wonder, a representative of all the ancient wisdom that modernity had supposedly abandoned. The 20th century witnessed an extraordinary revival of interest in the esoteric traditions associated with the ancient enigmatic figures. Partly, this was a reaction against the materialism and mechanization of modern life, a search for meaning and mystery in a world that seemed increasingly stripped of both. The ancient figures offered something that modern culture seemed to lack, a vision of human potential that extended beyond the merely material, an understanding of the universe as something more than a collection of random particles obeying impersonal laws. New religious movements and philosophical societies drew heavily on the traditional associated with figures like Hermes, Trismegistus, and Pythagoras. The Theosophical Society, founded in the late 19th century, claimed to preserve ancient wisdom teachings that stretched back to the dawn of human civilization. The Hermetic traditions experienced a renaissance among individuals seeking alternatives to both traditional religious orthodoxy and scientific materialism. The ancient figures became, once again, symbols of a different way of being in the world. But this modern revival faced the same challenges that had confronted all previous attempts to recover ancient wisdom. The gap between historical reality and psychological need remained unbridgeable. The ancient figures continued to serve as blank canvases onto which each generation could project its own hopes and fears, its own vision of what human beings might become if they could transcend their current limitations. The specific historical individuals remained elusive, hidden behind layers of interpretation and reinterpretation that had accumulated over centuries. Contemporary scholarship has attempted to navigate between the extremes of uncritical reverence and dismissive skepticism. The best modern historians of ancient thought try to understand these figures in their own contexts, to see them as products of their particular time and place, while still acknowledging their genuine contributions to human understanding. It is a delicate balance, one that requires both rigorous intellectual discipline and imaginative sympathy. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus presents perhaps the most interesting case study in this regard. Modern scholarship has established with reasonable certainty that the Hermetic texts were not written by a single ancient Egyptian sage, but were instead composed by various authors over several centuries during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. They represent a fascinating synthesis of Egyptian, Greek, and other Mediterranean religious and philosophical traditions. But they are not what they have traditionally been claimed to be. Does this scholarly consensus diminish the value of the Hermetic texts? The question reveals the complexity of our relationship with ancient wisdom. If we value these texts primarily as historical documents, then their actual date and authorship matters enormously. But if we value them as repositories of spiritual and philosophical insight, then their historical origins may be less important than their ability to speak to perennial human concerns about the nature of reality, consciousness, and our place in the cosmic order. The same paradox applies to the other enigmatic figures from the ancient world. The historical Pythagoras was probably a remarkable individual, but he was not the semi-divine figure of later legend. The real Imhotep was an impressive polymath, but he was not the perfect sage that he became in the imagination of later generations. Yet the legendary versions of these figures have had an enormous impact on human intellectual and spiritual development. They have inspired countless individuals to pursue knowledge, wisdom, and self-understanding. The myths, in other words, have had real consequences in the world. The advent of the digital age has created new possibilities for both the study and the misrepresentation of ancient wisdom. On one hand, scholars now have access to vast databases of ancient texts, archaeological findings, and comparative materials that would have been unimaginable to previous generations of researchers. The tools of digital analysis allow for new kinds of pattern recognition and textual comparison that are revealing previously hidden connections and influences. The ancient world is becoming more accessible to serious study than it has ever been before. On the other hand, the same digital technologies that facilitate serious scholarship also make it easier than ever to spread misinformation and pseudo-historical claims about the ancient world. The internet is filled with websites, videos, and social media posts that present wildly inaccurate information about figures like Hermes Trismegistus and Pythagoras as established fact. The ancient enigmatic figures have become, once again, blank canvases for contemporary fantasies. But now these fantasies can spread with unprecedented speed and reach. This situation presents both challenges and opportunities. The challenge is to maintain standards of historical accuracy and intellectual rigor in an environment where sensational claims often receive more attention than careful scholarship. The opportunity is to use digital technologies to make serious research about the ancient world more accessible to general audiences, to bridge the gap between academic knowledge and popular understanding. Perhaps most importantly, the digital age is creating new forms of collective memory and new ways of relating to the past. The ancient enigmatic figures are being encountered by contemporary audiences not just through traditional texts and scholarly studies, but through multimedia, presentations, interactive websites, virtual reality experiences, and other digital media. These new forms of encounter are creating new kinds of relationships with these ancient figures. Relationships that are neither purely historical nor purely mythical, but something entirely new. The phenomenon of online communities dedicated to the study and practice of ancient wisdom traditions illustrates this point. Individuals from around the world can now connect with others who share their interest in Hermetic philosophy, Pythagorean mathematics, or Egyptian mysticism. These communities create new forms of collective interpretation and practice that are both rooted in ancient sources and adapted to contemporary needs and understanding. The ancient figures become, in effect, virtual teachers for digital age students. But these digital communities also face the perennial challenges that have always confronted attempts to recover ancient wisdom. How do we distinguish between authentic understanding and wishful thinking? How do we honor the genuine insights of ancient thinkers while avoiding the trap of uncritical reverence? How do we maintain intellectual honesty while still allowing room for the mystery and wonder that attracted us to these figures? These questions have no easy answers, but they continue to be worth asking. As we stand at the beginning of the 21st century, looking back across the vast expanse of human history, the enigmatic figures of the ancient world continue to pose fundamental questions about the nature of knowledge, wisdom, and human potential. They remain enigmatic not because we lack information about them, though in many cases we do, but because they embody questions that may be inherently unanswerable. What are the limits of human understanding? Is there a perennial wisdom that transcends cultural and historical boundaries? Can individual human beings achieve a level of insight that approaches the divine? These questions have been asked in every age, and they have received different answers depending on the intellectual and cultural context in which they were posed. The ancient Egyptians found in figures like Imhotep evidence that human beings could achieve remarkable mastery over both material and spiritual domains. The Greeks saw in Pythagoras proof that mathematical understanding could provide a key to the deepest mysteries of existence. The Renaissance humanists believed that ancient sages like Hermes Trismegistus had preserved a pristine wisdom that could be recovered and applied to contemporary problems. Each of these answers reflected the hopes and needs of the people who'd formulated them, but each also pointed toward something beyond the merely personal or cultural, a recognition that human consciousness is capable of remarkable achievements, that the boundary between the known and the unknown is permeable, and that the search for understanding is itself a form of spiritual practice. The enigmatic figures of the ancient world serve as symbols of these possibilities, even when, or perhaps especially when, their historical reality remains shrouded in uncertainty. The enduring appeal of these figures suggests that they fulfill a psychological and spiritual function that goes beyond their historical significance. They represent the human aspiration to transcend ordinary limitations, to achieve a level of understanding that integrates intellect and intuition, reason and revelation, human effort and divine grace. They embody the perennial human conviction that there are hidden depths to reality that can be explored and understood by those who are willing to undertake the necessary discipline and preparation. But they also serve as reminders of the limits of human knowledge and the dangers of intellectual hubris. The history of how these figures have been interpreted and reinterpreted over the centuries reveals how easily genuine insight can be confused with wishful thinking, how readily the search for wisdom can become a projection of contemporary prejudices and assumptions onto the past. The very elusiveness of these figures may be part of their value. They resist our attempts to possess them completely, to reduce them to simple formulas or clear-cut teachings. In this sense, the enigmatic figures of the ancient world function like koans in the Zen tradition. They present us with puzzles that cannot be solved through ordinary, rational analysis, but which may provoke insights that go beyond the limitations of conventional thinking. The question is not whether Hermes Trismegistus really existed as a historical individual, but what the figure of Hermes Trismegistus represents in terms of human potential and aspiration. The question is not whether Pythagoras actually possessed supernatural powers, but what the legendary Pythagoras tells us about the relationship between mathematical understanding and spiritual insight. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the enigmatic figures of the ancient world is that they continue to live in human consciousness after thousands of years. They have survived the collapse of the civilizations that originally produced them, the destruction of the libraries that housed their teachings, and the skeptical analysis of modern scholarship. They persist not as historical facts, but as living symbols, continuing to inspire new generations of seekers, scholars, and artists. This persistence suggests that these figures touch something fundamental in human nature, the conviction that reality has hidden depths, that consciousness has untapped potentials, and that the search for wisdom is the highest human calling. They represent what Carl Jung called archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that manifest in different forms across cultures and historical periods. The specific details of their biographies may be uncertain, but the archetypal patterns they embody remain as relevant today as they were thousands of years ago. The tradition they represent is not a static collection of ancient texts and practices, but a living stream of human inquiry that continues to evolve and develop. Each generation encounters these figures anew, finding in them resources for addressing the particular challenges and opportunities of their own time. The Hermetic tradition has adapted to serve the needs of medieval alchemists, Renaissance humanists, 19th century occultists, and contemporary seekers of alternative spirituality. The Pythagorean synthesis of mathematics and mysticism continues to inspire both serious mathematicians and popular writers on consciousness and cosmology. This adaptability is both a strength and a weakness of the tradition. Its strength lies in its ability to remain relevant across vastly different cultural contexts, to speak to perennial human concerns in language that each age can understand. Its weakness lies in its susceptibility to distortion and misrepresentation, its tendency to become whatever its interpreters need it to be rather than maintaining any clear identity of its own. The challenge for contemporary engagement, where this tradition is to find a middle path between uncritical acceptance and dismissive rejection. This requires what might be called a hermeneutics of generosity, an approach that takes seriously both the historical limitations of our knowledge about these figures and the genuine insights that the tradition associated with them has produced. Over the centuries, it means being willing to learn from ancient wisdom while maintaining critical discrimination about what is actually ancient and what is actually wise. Such an approach recognizes that the value of a text or teaching is not necessarily dependent on its historical pedigree. A Hermetic text, composed in the 3rd century CE, may contain genuine spiritual insights, even if it was not actually written by an ancient Egyptian sage. A Pythagorean mathematical theorem may be mathematically valid and aesthetically beautiful, even if it was not discovered by Pythagoras himself. The task is to separate the wheat from the chaff, to identify what is genuinely valuable in the tradition, while letting go of historical claims that cannot be substantiated. As we look toward the future, the enigmatic figures of the ancient world are likely to continue their long journey through human consciousness, taking on new forms and serving new functions as they encounter new cultural contexts and technological possibilities. The basic human needs that they have traditionally served, the need for meaning, for transcendence, for a sense of connection to something greater than individual existence, are unlikely to disappear, regardless of how much our external circumstances may change. The digital age is already creating new forms of encounter with these ancient figures. Virtual reality technologies may soon allow people to experience simulated versions of ancient temples and mystery schools, to participate in reconstructed ancient rituals, and to engage with AI-generated versions of ancient teachers. These technologies raise fascinating questions about the nature of authentic spiritual experience and the relationship between form and content in wisdom traditions. At the same time, advances in archaeological techniques, textual analysis, and historical research continue to shed new light on the actual historical contexts in which these figures lived and taught. The tension between historical accuracy and spiritual relevance is likely to become more rather than less complex as our knowledge of the past becomes more sophisticated and our technological capabilities for creative interpretation become more powerful. Perhaps the most important question for the future is whether we can develop new forms of wisdom that integrate the best insights of the ancient tradition with the best insights of contemporary science, psychology, and philosophy. The ancient figures succeeded in their own time because they were able to synthesize the knowledge available to them into coherent visions of human potential and cosmic order. The challenge for contemporary seekers is to accomplish something similar for our own time, to create new syntheses that honor the depth and breadth of human experience, while remaining grounded in the best available evidence about the nature of reality. This may require letting go of some cherished beliefs about the ancient world, while maintaining openness to insights that cannot be easily measured or quantified. It may require developing new forms of intellectual humility that acknowledge the limits of both scientific materialism and traditional spirituality. Most importantly, it may require recognizing that wisdom is not a possession to be acquired, but a relationship to be cultivated, a ongoing engagement with the mystery of existence that remains forever open to new discoveries and deeper understanding. The enigmatic figures of the ancient world will continue their journey through human consciousness, serving as guides and companions for future generations of seekers. They will be interpreted and reinterpreted, praised and criticized, followed and abandoned, as they have been for thousands of years. But through all these transformations, they will continue to point towards something essential in human nature: the conviction that life has meaning, that consciousness has depths, and that the search for understanding is itself a sacred calling. In the end, perhaps that is their greatest gift to us, not any specific teaching or practice, but the example of what it means to be fully human in relationship to the cosmos. They remind us that we are not merely biological machines or economic units, but conscious beings capable of wonder, insight, and transformation. They invite us to participate in the great human project of understanding ourselves and our place in the larger order of things. They call us to become, in our own time and in our own way, figures worthy of the same reverence and mystery that we accord to them. The ancient world has passed away, but its wisdom lives on in every human heart that remains open to wonder. The enigmatic figures who once walked the dusty roads of Egypt and Greece, who taught in temple schools and philosophic gardens, who gazed at the stars and contemplated the mysteries of number and form, continue their teaching in the silence, between words, in the space between thoughts, in the eternal moment where past and future meet in the living present of consciousness itself. And so the journey continues, as it has always continued, as it will always continue, through the dreams of humanity, toward a wisdom that is both ancient and eternally new, both deeply personal and universally shared, both firmly grounded in history and forever reaching toward the infinite possibilities that lie beyond the boundaries of what we think we know. The enigmatic figures of the ancient world live on, not as historical facts, but as living questions, not as final answers, but as eternal invitations to continue the search for understanding that makes us most deeply and authentically human. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the mind releases its grip on the concerns of the day and opens to the larger rhythms of existence, perhaps we can still hear their voices whispering across the centuries. Know thyself, seek wisdom, remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return, but in between you are consciousness itself, miraculous and mysterious, capable of understanding the very cosmos that gave you birth. The echo of that whisper may be all the wisdom we need, and all the wisdom we can ever truly possess. If this story stayed with you as you drifted off, support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. We release weekly journeys into the forgotten, and every dreaming soul is welcome here.